Maplewood Lane was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. Children rode bicycles in the summer, sprinklers ticked in neat suburban yards, and barbecues filled the air with the smell of grilled corn and sausages. Neighbors waved from driveways, sharing gossip about whose dog was digging holes or which family might be putting their house up for sale. And then there was Margaret Lane. Margaret had lived at the very end of the cul-de-sac for as long as anyone could remember. She was in her early 50s now, with silver-streaked hair always pulled back into a bun, and a wardrobe of plain cardigans that seemed to shrink her into the background of life. She was polite, reserved, and solitary. For years no one had thought much of it. But Margaret was hiding something so dark, so carefully buried, that it would take 2 decades and a neighbor's courage for the truth to claw its way into the light. Her next-door neighbor, Linda Porter, had moved in 15 years earlier. Linda was chatty, open, and the type of woman who always carried a casserole dish to welcome someone new. Over time, Linda had noticed little things about Margaret. Margaret never had visitors. She never traveled, never spoke of family, never mentioned a husband. And at night, sometimes, Linda swore she heard muffled noises through the thin hedge that separated their houses, like someone crying. Most people ignored Margaret's oddities. But Linda wasn't most people. One chilly October evening, as Linda watered her geraniums, she saw Margaret struggling with something in her yard. It looked heavy, wrapped in plastic sheeting, being dragged toward the garage. Margaret froze when she realized Linda was watching. Then she smiled, tight, unconvincing. "Just cleaning up some old things," Margaret said. But Linda couldn't shake the unease. What kind of old things did a woman drag like a body bag? That was the first time Linda thought Margaret might not just be strange, she might be dangerous. Margaret hadn't always been this way. 20 years ago she had been Margaret Dawson, a young woman with auburn hair, a sharp wit, and a smile that could light up a room. She'd grown up in a small farming town, married her high school sweetheart, and moved to the suburbs to start a life that looked ordinary on the outside. But her marriage to Daniel Dawson was anything but ordinary. Daniel was charming in public, cruel in private. He drank, he controlled, he hit. For years, Margaret endured it silently, believing what so many women believe, that things would get better, that she could change him, that leaving was impossible. Until one night, it wasn't Daniel who ended the fight. It was Margaret. It was the summer of 2003, and Margaret was 33 years old. The night that would haunt her forever began like so many others, with Daniel stumbling home drunk from the bar. His heavy boots slammed against the kitchen tiles, his voice already raised in irritation before he even reached the living room where Margaret sat nervously folding laundry. "Where's my dinner?" he barked, even though she had left a plate warming in the oven. When she rushed to retrieve it, his rage only grew. He slapped the plate out of her hands, scattering food across the linoleum. Margaret bent to clean the mess, but Daniel grabbed her by the arm, hauling her upright. His breath was sour with whiskey, his grip bruising. "You think you can make me wait? You think I'm some fool?" he shouted, his spit landing against her cheek. Margaret's heart pounded with a familiar mix of terror and resignation. This had been her life for years now, walking on eggshells, bracing for blows. But something was different that night. Something inside her broke. When Daniel raised his fist again, she ducked. He stumbled, striking his head against the corner of the counter. He swore and lunged at her, his hands closing around her throat. Margaret's vision blurred, spots dancing before her eyes. In that desperate moment, she reached for the heavy glass ashtray on the coffee table, the one Daniel used when he smoked indoors. She swung it with all the strength she had. The crack was sickening. Daniel crumpled to the floor, motionless. Margaret stood frozen, her hands trembling, the ashtray clattering from her grip. She waited for him to move, to groan, to curse her name. But he didn't. Daniel Dawson was dead. Panic surged through her. She couldn't call the police, who would believe her after years of silence. Daniel's friends all thought he was a good man. The neighbors saw them as a quiet couple. And what about her? She was the timid wife, the one who never spoke of her bruises. She imagined the headlines already. Wife snaps and murders husband in cold blood. No one would believe the truth. So Margaret did the unthinkable. She dragged Daniel's body into the garage, her muscles screaming with the effort. She wrapped him in tarp, just as she'd done with countless household projects, only this time she was wrapping away her life. That night, under cover of darkness, she loaded him into his own truck and drove out to the old quarry 20 miles away. It took her hours, but by sunrise Daniel Dawson was gone, swallowed by earth and silence. When neighbors asked where Daniel had gone, Margaret told them he had left her. That he had grown tired of marriage, tired of suburban life, and walked away. It wasn't hard to convince people. Men left their wives all the time. And just like that, Margaret became a woman with a secret. For the next 2 decades, Margaret lived quietly, carefully, cautiously. She sold Daniel's truck, donated his clothes, closed their joint bank accounts. She told anyone who asked that he had simply disappeared, and in time people stopped asking. But she never truly slept. At night, she replayed the sound of the ashtray cracking against bone. She dreamed of Daniel standing at the foot of her bed, blood dripping down his face, whispering, "You can't bury me forever." Her isolation grew. She avoided friendships, turned down invitations, refused to date. If she let someone in, they might see the truth. They might notice the shadows in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the fear that clung to her like a second skin. Margaret Lane became the quiet woman at the end of the street. And for 20 years her secret stayed buried. Until Linda Porter spoke up. Linda had never entirely believed Margaret's story about Daniel leaving. There were inconsistencies. Margaret never filed for divorce. She never dated anyone else. And every time someone mentioned Daniel, Margaret's face went pale. But what really gnawed at Linda was that night. The night she saw Margaret dragging something heavy into her garage. She told herself not to meddle. It was none of her business. Yet the memory festered, especially after Linda's own daughter went through a violent marriage. Watching her child nearly destroyed by an abusive man made Linda think differently about Margaret. What if Margaret hadn't been a murderer at all? What if she'd been a victim who had no choice? The thought kept her awake at night. Finally, one spring afternoon, when the weight of silence felt too heavy, Linda went to the police. Detective Aaron Whitmore had seen plenty of cold cases, but when Linda Porter walked into his office with her story, he hesitated. A neighbor's suspicion wasn't much to go on. After all, 20 years had passed. There was no missing person report, no evidence of foul play. But something in Linda's conviction unsettled him. She wasn't a gossip looking for attention. She was a woman burdened with unease. "Just look into it," Linda urged. "Please. For my peace of mind." So Whitmore did. He started by digging into Daniel Dawson's past. There was no record of him after 2003. No tax returns, no credit card activity, no sightings. It was as though he had vanished from the face of the earth. Margaret's story, that he had walked away, made less and less sense. Whitmore obtained a warrant to search Margaret's property. What he found was chilling. In the corner of her garage, hidden behind decades of boxes, was a single rusted shovel. Forensics revealed faint traces of human blood along the handle, too old to match easily but suspicious nonetheless. That was enough to bring Margaret in for questioning. At first, Margaret denied everything. She insisted Daniel had left. She told the story she had rehearsed for 20 years. But Detective Whitmore was patient. He showed her photos of other women who had come forward with stories of abuse. He talked about the cycle of violence, about how hard it was to leave. And slowly Margaret's resolve cracked. Her hands shook as she whispered the words she had carried like a chain around her neck. "I killed him." The confession poured out of her in a torrent of sobs. She told them about the ashtray, the quarry, the nights of silence. She spoke of bruises that never healed and the terror that consumed her marriage. She spoke of survival. But the law doesn't always care about context. Margaret Dawson, now Margaret Lane, was arrested for the murder of her husband 2 decades after the fact. The trial was a media sensation. Headlines screamed, "Suburban widow hid husband's death for 20 years." Reporters camped outside the courthouse, hungry for details. Was Margaret a cold-blooded killer who had deceived her neighbors for decades? Or was she a battered woman pushed beyond her limits? The prosecution painted her as manipulative, someone who had carefully concealed her crime. They showed photos of Daniel smiling at barbecues, claiming she had robbed him of his life. The defense, however, brought forth testimony from Margaret's co-workers, who had noticed her bruises but never spoken up. They presented medical records of old fractures, police reports of noise complaints, even a diary entry where Margaret had written, "I think one day he'll kill me." The courtroom was split, justice versus mercy, law versus humanity. When Margaret finally took the stand, she looked out at the sea of faces and spoke with a trembling voice. "I am not proud of what I did. But I am alive today because of it. And I lived with that guilt every single day for 20 years. Her words hung heavy in the air. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned. Margaret was found guilty of manslaughter, not murder. They recognized the abuse, the desperation, the years of silence. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 6. As she was led away in handcuffs, Margaret glanced once at Linda Porter in the gallery. Tears filled her eyes. For 2 decades no one had spoken for her. And yet, in the end, it was her neighbor's voice that freed her from silence, though not from consequence. Linda Porter visited Margaret once in prison. The meeting was awkward, filled with long silences. But before Linda left, Margaret said softly, "Thank you. If you hadn't spoken up, I might have died with this secret still locked inside me." Linda nodded, her own eyes brimming with tears. Secrets, she realized, were like cracks in a house. You could patch them, paint over them, pretend they weren't there. But eventually they spread. And when they finally broke open, the whole foundation shook. For 20 years, Margaret Lane lived with a dark secret. And when it finally came to light, it didn't just change her life, it changed an entire neighborhood. Because evil, pain, and silence can live next door for decades. And you'd never know until someone dares to speak.